You're listening to the audiobook version of Now That We Don't Talk by Love Curd on Tumblr and AO3. Warnings for this chapter: mild sexual content, a few homophobic slurs. This is semi-autobiographical, so please be kind. In short, if you're emotionally or mentally vulnerable, please do not interact. 1. When Will Byers first moved to California, it had taken him 2 whole months to fully unpack his boxes. And it wasn't really a mystery as to why. He had no desire to be there. Yes, he'd admit that he wasn't exactly the biggest fan of Hawkins either, considering the events of the past few years. But when it all came down to the nitty-gritty, Hawkins was the lesser of two evils. Because Hawkins had Mike, and Lenora was, well, Mike less. He'd never really thought about life without Mike in it up until then, because he didn't think he'd ever have to. But then he did have to, and it was an awful feeling. They'd driven away from the old house, and Will watched as Mike became smaller and smaller until he was merely a stick figure in the passenger side mirror. Will blinked his tears away and turned his gaze to the road ahead, trying to focus on the lyrics of whatever song by the Smiths that John was playing. But it was impossible to take his mind off of his new reality. As cliche as this sounds, Will felt a piece of his heart break that day. And from the look on Mike's face as he stood idly by, Mike leaning against his hip, he was hurting just as much as Will was. He had looked lost, confused, and hurt. Will could totally relate. When the Byers arrived in their new house, Will had mixed feelings about it at first, because that's what usually happens when you arrive in an unfamiliar environment, but those feelings pretty much dissipated within a day. The house was bigger, for one, which was nice in a way. It had 2 floors and had enough rooms in it so that Elle, John, and Will didn't have to bunk up like they'd been doing up until the move. It was in a bigger town than Hawkins was, so not everybody knew each other's business, which was great considering that the zombie boy name hadn't been able to tag along for the ride. It was a lot warmer than it had been in Hawkins, and he'd grown to hate the cold over the past few years, so that was a welcome change. It was a welcome change for everyone. They'd taken time during their first week in their new home just to sit together on the deck, basking in the sunshine. They learned quickly that sunscreen was a must in California, even when it wasn't scorching hot. Will had burned his nose on more than one occasion, and Elle proceeded to call him Rudolph at every possible opportunity. Elle's addition to the family was another perk of moving. Elle and Joyce had been able to bond really well, albeit over the loss of Hopper, but also because Joyce finally had a daughter. Elle and John got along too, which was nice. And Will was cool with her. She never did anything wrong to him. Besides dating Mike, of course, but that was completely out of his control. Plus, it wasn't like he'd ever want to be with Will in that way. He'd set that in stone over that one summer when he told Will, "It's not my fault you don't like girls." Not even half an hour after their fight in the rain, Mike and Lucas had biked over to Will's house to apologize. Of course, his demolition of Castle Byers and the return of the Mind Flayer had Will kind of preoccupied at that point, so nothing officially happened to resolve that situation. It was the subject change of the century. They got so wrapped up in the upside-down stuff that Mike and Will put it off, then put it off some more, and then swept it under the rug altogether. Nothing was the same after that night. At least, not on Will's end. What Mike said to him kind of changed his life. He'd become so dependent upon Mike's overwhelming presence near him all the time that he kind of lost sight of himself and his own identity. In his mind, he wasn't Will. He was Mike's friend Will. He felt worthless without Mike, and was always so quick to forgive him out of fear of losing him that he'd inadvertently become passive with a capital P. And he didn't want to be that way anymore. So Will created a strictly platonic boundary between them, one that allowed the tension to dissolve, and to give himself space to grieve the idea of Mike he'd created, the one who loved Will back. And then, they were back to best friends again, just in time for Will to move. At least he and Mike would still be able to talk over the phone. Will could not have been more wrong. Mike did not make a single call for the entire 7 months that he was in Lenora. He didn't send a single letter, either. Well, at least not to Will. Elle was in correspondence with him literally every week, practically skipping into the house after trips to the mailbox with letters upon letters in her hands, beaming with excitement. Will hated to admit it, but it got really annoying after a while. Then she'd started building a shoebox shrine to Mike, and Will was just like, what's so special about him? He's just Mike. But then he realized that if he were in her shoes, he would be doing the exact same thing. Because he was just Mike. And that was why Will loved him. After watching this go on for a few months, Will kind of fell into a depression. and Elle was too busy swooning over all the from Mikes to notice that he was falling apart. Will had resigned from the idea of reaching out to Mike because Mike hadn't made any kind of effort to reach out to him. That was when he decided to finally start unpacking his boxes. Unpacking meant that the move became real. Unpacking meant that it was permanent. Unpacking meant that he'd have to officially start his new life at a new school, high school, without Mike in it. Each box represented a call or letter Elle received. His clothes were put on hangers in the closet, and his art supplies finally found a place next to his bedroom window. And all of Mike's writing was shoved away into the darkest depths of Will's lowest desk drawer, never to see the light of day again. Yeah, Will was being petty, but he was angry. He deserved to be angry, damn it. He was angry at Mike for abandoning him, and he was angry at himself for being delusional enough to believe Mike cared that much about their friendship. But then, Will started the painting. The painting. He'd sworn to himself that he would stop making art that revolved around Mike. He would no longer be Will's muse. He'd started off the piece as a typical landscape, but he added the Thessal Hydra, and then he added himself, Lucas, Dustin, and Mike at the front, leading the party to victory. Screw it, Will had thought to himself. Everyone else is in the painting, it'd be weird to not include Mike. When he painted the red heart on Mike's shield as a finishing touch, it hit Will like a truck that he'd created one of his best paintings to date with Mike in his subconscious thoughts the whole time. Mike was inescapable. There was no use in ripping himself up over what he couldn't control, so Will figured he'd just give Mike the painting during spring break. Spring break happened, and boy, man really, the boyish look had almost completely faded away. Mike had changed, in more ways than one. He'd shown up at the airport gate nearly half a foot taller, with sharper cheekbones, longer hair, and a deeper voice, wearing the dumbest looking outfit Will had ever seen. He was so happy to see Mike. Mike hadn't been as excited as Will was, considering the timid clap on the shoulder he'd been given while Will had gone in expecting one of Mike's amazing tight hugs. He'd always given the best hugs. Not anymore. So Will tucked the rolled-up painting back under his arm and took a step back, letting Elle and Mike have their time together as a couple. He admired Mike from afar, but that was all Will ever did. Mike had changed in more ways than one. He'd gotten so much more attractive, but he'd also turned into a total asshole. Will finally confronted him about his standoffish behavior at Ringomania, and he'd placed all the blame on Will, not once taking responsibility for essentially forgetting that Will existed, and on his birthday, no less. When he asked why Elle got so many letters while he got absolutely nothing, Mike replied that it was because she was his girlfriend, which, yeah, obviously. But when Will followed up with, "And us?" Mike had snapped, "We're friends. We're friends." As the two of them laid in bed that night, it set in that Mike had taken Will's question in a romantic context. That made his heart flutter a little bit, but he shut himself down immediately because he was not going down that road again. Will's mood hadn't shifted much when they initially arrived back in Hawkins, following the worst road trip he had ever had the displeasure of going on. He had been trapped in a weed-infused van, sitting inches away from a wordless Mike. He'd given the painting to Mike and lied about its origins just to boost his ego. And worst of all, Will endured an emotional Michael monologue in which he told Elle that he loved her multiple times. When they got out of the van, Will had taken the biggest sigh of relief because thank God the suffering was over. Oh wait, no, scratch that, because the suffering had only just begun. Vecna was the him Will was feeling all those years, and he was destroying Hawkins as they spoke. About a month into the Vecna apocalypse, Dustin had been the one to coin that term, and Will doubled over laughing during a very important group meeting when he'd first used it. Mike had told Will that he'd finally broken up with Elle. Will was secretly elated. The Moat Fest was finally over. But when Mike revealed the reason why they had broken up, which was the very painting that Will had used as a device to try and clear the air between Mike and his sister, Will's back-breaking efforts seemed to be all for nothing. They had a little argument turned heart to heart about it, but they hugged it out in the end like best friends do. And things were fine. They were a team again, and that's what mattered most. The dynamic between Mike and Will changed, though, throughout the course of the Vecna apocalypse. And Will wasn't complaining. They'd gone from being virtually radio silent to whatever the situation was. They'd flirt, hold hands, listen to each other's mixtapes, and partnered up together during missions. This continued on for a while until one particular moment in the Upside Down, when Mike had leaned in a bit too close, almost as if they were about to... No way. Will was beyond tempted to lean in as well, caving into the deepest desire he'd ever had in his life, kissing Michael James Wheeler square on the mouth. And he almost did. However, in typical Mike fashion, ever the dramatic, Mike jumped backwards, stumbled outside, tripped over a gigantic vine, and triggered a bunch of demo bats to swarm the upside-down version of the Wheeler house. After that shit show, Will couldn't help but be a little bit bitter towards Mike. That side battle could have cost them everything. Vecna could have won. And on top of all that, Will was tired of being led on by Mike and all of his contradictions, so he kept Mike at a physical distance from there on out. They never brought up the almost kiss ever again. Things got even stranger a few years later. On one particularly gross day in August of 1989, he dropped by the Wheelers to ask Mike if he wanted to watch a movie later that night. Will headed up to Mike's room, and the door was slightly ajar, so he lightly knocked. No response. Mike probably had his headphones on or something. Will walked in, but he was nowhere to be seen. Mike's notebook was lying open on his desk beside a pile of multiple ripped-out pages, with one of his signature blue lay pens sitting on top of the page, the cap cast to the side. Mike had a bad habit of accidentally letting his overly expensive pens dry out, so Will figured he'd do him a favor and put it back on and save him the trouble. He took a few steps over to Mike's desk and reached for the pen, but immediately paused in his tracks when he noticed the first two words written on top of the page. Dear Will. He shouldn't have read any further, because he wasn't sure if it was Mike's intention for him to even see it, but it was too late to go back. His eyes involuntarily scanned the page, widening more and more with every sentence. Dear Will, when I look into your eyes, I see the rest of my life. Poetic, I know. Kinda came out of nowhere. You know I'm not much of a poetry kind of guy, I'm more of a storyteller, but the thought came to me in a dream I had about you, and I just had to write it down in one of these letters. Hold up, Will thought. What the hell? He had a dream about me? Why would he have a dream about... Why me? What letters? What was he talking about? His eyes hesitantly drifted to the pile of papers beside the notebook. He gulped, his suspicions confirmed. You're asleep in my bed, and I'm hunched over my desk, writing this letter because I'm freaking the fuck out. And not because I almost ruined our chance to defeat Vecna. Well, that too, sorry about that. But the primary reason for my current freakout session is because we almost kissed. And that's weird. He flipped to the next one. Something is wrong with me. I swear to God, I didn't mean for this to happen, but I keep staring at you for longer than I should, and I can't look away. I haven't been able to since the almost kiss, TM. You've caught me looking these past few times, and I feel myself burning up like a match every time. And I've come to the conclusion that you, Will Byers, are my flame. And the next one. I've kind of gotten used to sleeping in the same bed as you, subconsciously cuddling through the night and waking up tangled together. Your face is so relaxed right now, and you hum contentedly to yourself every few minutes. It's so fucking cute. I'm glad you're not having as many nightmares anymore. Or, at least you're having slightly better dreams. I should go to bed soon. I don't want you to catch me writing. But, yeah, you're adorable, and I really like you. And the next one. I was so caught off guard by the fact that you called me cute that I couldn't get any words out. You turned around quickly to get your bike and hopped on, giving me a small wave as you left my driveway. And it hit me then. I love you. I am in love with you. Unabashedly, wholeheartedly, head over my fucking heels in love with you. And believe me, this has been a long time coming, and not just because you complimented me. I think I've loved you for a long time. I just didn't know what it was. And the next one. Why does loving you feel so wrong, yet so right? It seems like for every thought I have about you, another comes to bite me in the ass. I wish I could just think about you in peace without all of the shame. But at the same time, I know it isn't normal for me to like you, to love you, to want you. I'm usually able to stop my mind from wandering into that territory, but there's something about you that is making it more and more difficult for me to resist those thoughts from entering my head. I think the main culprit is your shoulders. Yes, I said it. I'm attracted to your shoulders. Specifically when you wear your polo shirts that are a size or two too small and hug your upper body a little too tightly. Or when you steal my leather jacket and shove it on and it accentuates your arms rather than making them disappear like it does to mine. You're so attractive, it's actually crazy. I think my brain needs to catch up to my heart, because my heart is thriving, but my brain is a killjoy. Another. I turned to my dad with a wild look in my eyes, probably, and said some shit like, yeah, me and my boyfriend, Will Byers, had such a great time last night. We stared longingly into each other's eyes for hours. Then we cuddled. Then we kissed. And then we got each other off. It was so hot, Dad. Truly, I wish you could have seen. I know what I said was a lot. I mean, it was pretty vulgar. Plus, it's never actually happened, and it never will happen. So I'm sorry about that. Another. I found this set of dice, though, and they were just so you. They were a deep translucent purple with gold stars painted around each number, all of which were also gold. They reminded me of your Will the Wise costume. I know you haven't worn it in a long time, and that's probably my fault. I think the last time you wore it was the day we had that fight in the garage when I told you it wasn't my fault you didn't like girls. And the sick, twisted irony of that is, in reality, I'm the one out of the both of us who doesn't like girls. Another. I think about you and those fucking gorgeous lips almost every waking moment, and the urge to follow through with my desire to kiss you always gets stronger whenever you're in the room. Which is unfortunate since you're always in the room now. Specifically my room, because it's summer, so of course we're hanging out every day. We made that stupid promise to dedicate one-on-one time to just the two of us. If only one-on-one was synonymous with you on me. Or me on you? Either would work for me, honestly. But there's something about the thought of you straddling me and leaning your entire body weight onto me that makes me weak in the knees. I'm kind of glad your mom wanted you home tonight, because there's only so long I can refrain from lunging into your space and holding your face in between my hands and... But then, your very short swim trunks clung to your thighs, and eventually I was able to see the full outline of your dick. Like, the whole thing. Those shorts do not leave anything to the imagination. And imagine I did. I began to fantasize about the most lewd things. Getting you off with my hand, sucking you until you came down my throat, using those thick thighs to grind myself down onto, groping your perfect ass as you flip me over onto my back, feeling the sensation of our cocks rubbing together through our clothes, feeling you on me, inside of me. That last mental image snapped me out of my thoughts, and I realized I was rock hard in my own swim trunks. We fell asleep, together, on the couch last night, cuddling like we had during the time that you lived with me, and I felt something similar to homesickness, nostalgia. When we woke up, I was resting my head on your chest, and I shifted my eyes upwards to look at your lips, which were slightly parted by the soundest of sleeps. I wanted to kiss you. I really, really wanted to kiss you, Will. And I want you to hold me in your arms forever, because it's the only place I can truly call home. Will continued shuffling through the letters, counting 25, plus the one in the notebook, which made a grand total of 26. He could barely believe what he was seeing. This had to be a creative writing exercise or something. Or maybe Mike had met another person named Will and fallen deeply in love with them? Or maybe it was a cruel joke Mike was playing on him, because he'd decided that writing love letters would be a good prank to pull on his gay best friend. Mike had no right to do this to him. No fucking right. Will ripped the last letter out of the notebook, gathered the rest of them between his sweaty hands, and headed down the 2 flights of stairs leading to the basement. When he'd attempted to confront Mike about the letters, Will was pinned against the wall and kissed as if it were something he should have been expecting that entire time. There was no way Will could have fathomed that this was how his time in Hawkins was going to close out. He'd been looking forward to the point in his life where everything could just be normal for once. He'd been on a decent roll for the past 2 years. But Mike just had to go and drop the bomb on Will that he wanted the two of them to spend the rest of their lives together. And that threw Will for a goddamn loop, because in what world, in what universe, was Mike Wheeler loving him, Will Byers, even remotely viable? Had the Upside Down come back again? Was Will trapped in a nightmarish torture chamber with Mike as the subject of said nightmare? He would believe it, honestly. When Will mentally added up the Vecnapocalypse period of their relationship, including the almost kiss, the endless mixed signals afterwards, senior prom, the letters, and the probability that Mike would have just let Will leave town without admitting his stupid, dumb, impossible feelings, or letting him know about all of those love letters he'd written over the past few years. It made sense. And that kiss, if he'd really meant it, made Mike's stance on their relationship crystal fucking clear, leaving Will feeling breathless and blindsided. By the time he escaped the Wheeler house that humid August evening, with tears following the semi-permanent track marks that stained Will's face due to crying for literal years back to back, He knew for sure and certain that he couldn't spend one more week in Hawkins, Indiana. He was done. Will had been pretty damn quick about escaping Hawkins to begin with, but the urgency to get away from Mike only accelerated his timeline. He spent the rest of the summer avoiding Mike at all costs. He'd been working at Melvald's with his mom all summer, but started picking up extra hours under the guise of wanting to save as much money as he could for a new car, which he'd already had more than enough money for, but still. Time spent at work was time spent away from Mike. And a couple extra paychecks couldn't hurt. Joyce certainly didn't complain. She loved having Will around, and savored every moment she could with her baby boy before he moved to the Windy City. Will realized, as he sat on his mattress amongst heaps of boxes scattered across the floor of his dorm at the American Academy of Art, that anger seemed to fuel his unpacking process. It ignited the flame of desire for transition and change in his life. And oh, after the summer Will just had, did he desperately need a change. This particular change, Will decided, would be good for him. He was out of Hawkins, at his dream school, about to begin studying the subject that he loved most in the entire world, and Michael Wheeler wasn't around anymore to throw him off. He grabbed a marker out of his pencil case and marked off the date on his calendar. Sunday, August 20th, 1989. This was going to be a good, dramaless, normal year. Will could feel it. That's everything, huh? He turned to look towards the doorway, where his mom stood with misty eyes. She took a few steps inside, letting the door close, and Will hopped off his bed and wrapped her in a tight embrace, kissing the top of her head. Yeah, this is it, Will said, his voice shaking a little bit with overwhelming emotion. It was bittersweet. Yes, he hated Hawkins and was grateful to have finally escaped, but he also hated the idea of leaving his mom back in Indiana. She'd brushed Will's concern off, saying she wouldn't be alone because his stepdad would be there with her. Will didn't even like referring to Hopper as his stepdad. He had accidentally called Hopper Dad over dinner a year ago, and after an emotional encounter where James Hopper, the Hawkins chief of police, shed actual tears, the name kind of stuck. Hopper couldn't make the trip up to Chicago with Joyce as he needed to help Elle move into her dorm at Vanderbilt University. Joyce pulled back to smile up at Will. You are going to do, and are already doing, great things in this world, Will. You deserve every opportunity you've been given, and more. I'm so proud to be your mom. He felt tears pricking his eyes. He'd miss his mom the most. I love you, Will replied, hugging her once more in order to avoid having an emotional breakdown. He'd gotten close to having one at least 5 times throughout the day, but never did. He saw the door open out of his peripheral vision, and he lifted his head to see a guy step into the room. His hair was shaved down to a buzz cut, and a copious amount of freckles splayed themselves across his face. He casually strode right past Will, without even acknowledging his existence, before tossing a duffel bag onto his bed and unzipping it. Only now did Will notice the near-complete setup on the other side of the room. He'd apparently been here for a while. Will decided to talk first and introduce himself because this guy clearly wasn't willing to make any effort. He wanted to make a good impression, even if Buzzcut Dude didn't. Hey, I'm Will, Byers. Aaron Heathrow. Buzzcut Dude, Aaron replied, turning towards Will. They gained eye contact for the first time, and Aaron's eyebrows curved into backwards S's on his forehead. He looked Will up and down and scoffed, returning to his unpacking without another word. Well, this was going to be an awkward arrangement, that was for sure. Honey, let's go check out the common area. Joyce broke the silence, and Will couldn't help but glare back at her. He wanted to deal with this on his own. Will loved his mom with his entire heart and would literally die for her, but this was not his idea of a fresh start. Joyce gave him a knowing look, and Will, knowing his mother's stubborn nature all too well, followed her out the door and down the hallway. She led them toward the armchairs in the common area and gestured for him to sit down next to her. Will knew where this was going, but he obliged anyway. Are you sure? Mom, oh my god, I'm fine. He just seemed very... Yeah, okay, he was rude. Will kept his voice low at the risk of people overhearing, but keeping his tone firm. But not everyone in this world is kind. I, of all people, should know that. He watched as his mom's features fell from their usual anxiety-riddled state and into more of an empathetic sadness. I just don't want you to get hurt, she murmured, and for a second he felt badly for snapping. He shook off that shame because as unfortunate as this situation was, Will knew in his gut that he was right. The world didn't owe kindness to him. But he also knew he didn't owe kindness to the world either. It had taken enough from Will already. I just want to stick this out for a little bit before jumping to conclusions, he said, and his mom went to talk, but he continued on before she could. I'll switch rooms if anything does happen, I promise. He took his mom's hands in his own in an attempt to put her mind at ease, which would not be an easy feat, but he could at least try. Apparently it worked, because the next thing she said to Will caught him off guard. "Okay, sweetie. I'm sorry if I overstepped." Who was this woman and what did she do with Joyce Byer's hopper? Hell if Will knew. "No, it's fine," he reassured her. I want to start making my own decisions and being more independent and stuff. And I want you to know that I'll be okay." He placed a hand on Joyce's shoulder, knowing that this transition would be incredibly difficult for her to process. After everything that had happened with the Upside Down, Will had been shocked when his mom was so encouraging regarding his pursuit of art school. He had assumed that she would want him to stay as close to Hawkins as possible, but in the end, she had been the one to slide the American Academy of Art pamphlet across the table. "I know you will." Joy smiled up at Will, reaching up to pat his cheek. He leaned into the affection, knowing that this would probably be his last time seeing his mom until Thanksgiving. She raised her left wrist up to her face and squinted at her watch. "I should start heading home before it gets dark. I love you, my sweet boy." Will couldn't help but pull Joyce in for one last hug, feeling the emotion creep back into his voice as he told his mom that he loved her so much and to call him when she got home so he'd know she was safe and sound. He walked her out of the main lobby, waving as she headed back to the visitor parking lot. When she pulled away, Will turned on his heel and headed back up to his dorm room. His dorm room. Holy shit. He was in college. What even was life? Will opened the door to his room and saw Aaron laying on his bed. His basketball short-clad legs spread obnoxiously far apart in front of him as he read what looked like a book about the reign of Ronald Reagan. Lovely. Will diverted his eyes before Aaron could catch him staring and focused on the pile of boxes he had yet to unpack. He picked one up, set it down on the edge of the bed, and unfolded the pre-bent corners on the top to reveal his extensive sweater collection. Perfect. He pulled out the blue sweatshirt on top, letting it fall into its full form in his hands. Oh god. This was Mike's sweatshirt, the one Will stole from him last winter. He laid it out on the mattress and reached in for the next sweater, but there weren't any more. He peered inside the box to see the dice that Mike had given him for his 17th birthday, the picture frame that held a photo Jonathan had taken last year when Mike had the genius idea to hop his 6'3" self up onto the handlebars, and the binder that held all of Mike's letters that he'd written to Will. He'd kept everything in a shoebox under his bed back home, and he had no recollection of packing them. How did they end up making it to Chicago with him? No matter how it happened, it had, and Will was stuck with all these memories of Mike. He would never throw them out because that would most definitely keep him up at night. And he didn't want to hide them away because despite the sadness he felt when he looked at them, they were also accompanied by a strange sense of appreciation for what he and Mike did have. 13 years of friendship. That's still something, right? Will shrugged the sweatshirt on. "I'm wearing it because it's comfortable," he tried to justify himself, to himself, not for any other reason. Now that that was settled, Will was determined to unpack something that would make his room feel like his own. He set the dice in the picture frame on his desk and reached over to the rolled-up posters that sat on top of all his bags. He removed the tape from the edges of one of them and unrolled it to reveal the album cover of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. He smiled to himself and grabbed a few thumbtacks from his box labeled school supplies before standing on top of his mattress and hanging the poster on the wall. Once Will was satisfied with its placement, 5 attempts and 3 concerningly lost thumbtacks later, he got off of his mattress and took a step back to admire his work, putting his hands on his hips. "Elton John?" he heard a voice ask from behind him, and Will turned around to face Aaron, whose facial expression had turned into what looked like disgust. He'd forgotten Aaron was even there. Jeez, man, if I knew I'd be dorming with a fag this year, I'd have brought my gun. He knew it. He knew Aaron was a homophobe. He knew it from the second he looked Will up and down when he introduced himself earlier. Maybe Will's mom was better to shoot you with, my dear, Will replied coolly, before snapping his mouth shut and widening his eyes at the realization that he was the one who had just said that. He'd never been good at comebacks. That was more of Mike's specialty. In high school, Will was the one stuttering out the lamest retorts of all time while Mike verbally kicked their bullies' asses right back at record speed. Will envied his lack of filter sometimes. "What did you just say?" Aaron narrowed his eyes and moved to get off his bed and meet Will in the middle of their room, so they stood face to face. Will could feel Aaron's breath on his face, and it smelled like stale sour cream and onion chips, but he stood his ground. "I said," Will lowered his voice, moving closer into Aaron's space, "I'm a pretty damn good shot, so you'd best leave me alone." Aaron took a few steps away from Will and put his hands up in surrender. Good. When Will promised to himself that things were going to be different, he meant it. He was not going to take any shit from this guy, Or anyone else, for that matter. Not anymore. Where was I? Will asked himself, flipping right back into the good mood he'd been in before. He picked up the next one and hummed to himself before hanging up his poster of The Cure's Boys Don't Cry. You've been listening to the audiobook version of Now That We Don't Talk by Love Kurt on Tumblr and AO3. Stay tuned for Chapter 1, Part 2.